So we are talking again about the problem of animal suffering and the existence of God, and in particular, replying to the recent video of Inspiring Philosophy's channel, which featured Christopoulos and Trent Dougherty, where they argue for an animal soul-making theodicy, which involves an animal afterlife, a transformation of animals into rational beings who endorse their suffering that they went through. And we're going to reply to some of their other counterpoints that's been made in a sort of back and forth that's been going back to my debate where I teamed up with Alex O'Connor to take on Stuart and Cliff Connectley. But I'm joined by the brilliant philosophers Alex Malpass and Ken Williford. How you doing, guys? Alex, what are you drinking?
Well, I'm drinking liquor because I'm going to get triggered, basically. So I'm going to kind of liquor myself up a little bit to null the pain when it comes to it.
Now, a bit of context. Ken and I have put forward what we call the expanded problem of animal suffering because we think Christians have to not only explain the suffering animals experience in nature, but also the apparent cruelty that God either commands or commits towards animals in the Bible. And for this first clip, which I think really gets to the heart of the matter, we're referring to Joshua 11:6, where God commands the Hebrew armies to hamstring their opponents' horses, which involves crippling the horses so that they can't walk. Now, this seems incredibly cruel when God could have used gentler methods. He could have taught the Israelites to disable the combatants and not the horses. He could have tranquilized the horses during the battle, or he could have even teleported them off the battlefield. So why command this cruel torture?
So Tham, what would you say specifically to the idea that God should teleport the horses somewhere else?
Yeah, well, again, I'm going to employ the defeat condition here, first of all. And then the other point, given that, then what Phil has to do, or the skeptic has to do, is say that this is the type of suffering that would render it impossible for those horses to have a life they consider from that point on a life on the good whole, including the afterlife, right?
Impossible.
Where they're given a praiseworthy status and all this other stuff.
And let's just draw that out for a second. See, what does that proposition look like? It would be something like, given infinite resources and infinite time, it would be impossible for that horse to look upon its life as a on balance good and a life consistent with a loving God.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like 1 trillion years from now in paradise, he's going to look back and be like, but there was that one time where you let me be cut. This is...
Yeah. And there's going to be...
It's a very bad thing, but very bad things happen to people, and they become okay. They have wonderful lives.
Yeah, and so if the horses can retroactively consent to this, I don't think that there is much of an issue. Add in some sort of theodicy that's going to predict something like the biblical meta-narrative into the mix, for instance, and the fact that I think there's an issue here again because the technical term is like a deus ex machina, right? Which is like this unique solution that you're expecting to find to every single particular instance, which is just going to be some sort of arbitrary optimization rather than something actually being better. Because Phil could say, or anybody can say, yeah, teleporting the horses would be better. But now what's going on is you're kind of taking this one sentence in the whole entire narrative of reality, and you think that that's going to produce the same type of reality. It's hard. You don't judge things based off of one sentence. You're going to take the whole narrative arc together.
What are your thoughts?
I mean, there's a lot to unpack, right? So if we're just going to zoom in on the main philosophical idea behind what they're all cheerleading for, which is very much the thing that was in the sights of your paper too. So I think it's a useful place to outline the theory in more detail. So it's what's the easiest way to explain it? So they're saying that there's this what Sam describes as a defeat condition. So the idea is that basically evil can be defeated in some wider theological context, right? So defeat in this tradition kind of goes back to it's hard to know exactly where it goes back to, but at least goes back to Chisholm's work in the 60s on intrinsic value. And it just happened to have been reading this book recently. This is Chisholm's book on Brentano and intrinsic value. And the end of that, this is from like 1986 or something, but It's where he's spelling out this idea he had about what defeat is, and I think it's a really cool idea. It's a really neat idea. So the idea is something like, I mean, there's a whole lot of like theory of intrinsic value, which I'm not going to go into. I just sort of presuppose that, but the basic intuitive picture is something like this: you can have a situation where like someone like Smith is in pleasure, and we just want to say that's intrinsically good. Like it's a good thing if someone's in pleasure. And if Jones is intrinsically in displeasure, say pain or something, if the intensity of those two is like basically the same, then you're going to say overall, the kind of context that includes both of those facts, that's like neutral, because the two things kind of just cancel out. There's goodness on this side and there's equal amount of badness on the other side. And just like a weighing scale, so you kind of like neither side tilts in that direction. So that's what we call balancing out, right? That's not defeat, according to Chisholm. Defeat, according to Chisholm, is where you have this kind of miraculous-looking situation where you've got one value on one side and no value counterbalancing it on the other side, but for some reason the weighing scales don't tip in favour of the one where there's some value there. So the key example is like Smith is in pleasure again, so we're going to say, okay, that's intrinsically good. But now what we do is we say the thing that Smith is in pleasure about is Jones's state of displeasure. So he's just contemplating Jones being in pain, and he's like happy about that. So the thing is, there's something distasteful about like enjoying somebody else's pain like that. So the thought is that, you know, it's actually not intrinsically good anymore. Now it's just bad, right? It's a bad thing that Smith is in pleasure about whilst contemplating Jones's displeasure. So, but because it's just a contemplation of Jones's displeasure, we could just state that he's actually not in displeasure. He's doing fine, right? But Smith is imagining him as if he was in pain and deriving pleasure from that. So so he's got some pleasure. There's no counterbalancing displeasure because Jones isn't actually in displeasure. So there's just like a pleasure on this side, but it doesn't tilt towards good. If anything, it actually tilts the other direction, which is weird because there's like nothing weighing it down on that side, right? So that's defeat. It's where, for some reason, sort of mysteriously, when you first start thinking about it, the presence of some intrinsic good doesn't make the kind of wider context that it's in. It doesn't contribute its goodness in the normal way to the wider context that it sits within. So that is then used, that basic framework, although slightly differently. Marilyn McCord Adams uses this kind of defeat theodicy in her books. One of them is Christianity and Horrendous Evils or something. Actually, I can't remember the full name of that. Horrendous Evils and whatever, something like Horrendous Evils and whatever, where she uses this a notion of defeat to argue that basically something broadly like, I mean, it's quite complicated, but something broadly along the lines of like, you know, after you die, God could include you in this beatific vision, or, you know, it's a moving target. The different places she describes it in different ways, which is fair enough because she's kind of kicking the idea about rather than being super dogmatic. But this point is supposed to be that, like, just like in that, somehow similar to that example I just gave you there, at this action of like unification with God or whatever it is, defeats the evils that you went through. So she's not trying to say, you know, a good God would never allow any evils to happen. What she's doing really is trying to say, if any evils beset you, then God will make sure that the overall picture of your life, you will come to recognize that it is actually okay. You know, that acceptance is part of this wider defeat condition. And of course, Doherty's idea is to take that model and just kind of expand it, I guess, so that it includes animals as well. So normally you'd think, well, animals can't come to recognize the kind of metaphysical significance of their suffering or whatever because they're not fully rational. But if you just suppose that they get, you know, upgraded with rationality, then they could come to appreciate the cosmic narrative in which their suffering makes sense or something, and it allows them this possibility of defeating evil in the way that Adams wants to give it. So all I've done really is like recap the picture. I mean, does that make sense? Do you feel like I've misread?
I mean, I think the key point, is that they endorse what happened to them, right?
Yeah.
They think it was good in the end, the whole arc of their history.
That's true. Yeah, that does seem to be a key idea for Adams, and that's certainly what these guys, Doherty and Than. I don't know quite whether inspiring philosophy. What's his actual name? I don't like calling people by their kind of
His name's Mike Jones.
Right, yeah, of course, yeah. I don't know if he's also signed up card carrying kind of Dohertarian or whatever the term is for these people. But yeah, certainly Than and Trent Dougherty are like pushing this idea quite hard. I mean, I don't know, Ken, I'm interested to know whether you think I've characterized that well, and maybe if there's anything else you'd say to set the idea up.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the basic idea they're operating off of is something reasonably familiar. Like, when I was in high school, my father made me work at a car wash one summer, 6 days a week, 10 hours a day, and I hated it. It involved a lot of unpleasantness, but afterwards, when I, like years later, I kind of, like a year later or so, progressively, let's say, realized what he was doing, which was to give me an idea of like what working class life can be like, and so that I would have some understanding of that and not just be an entitled, spoiled rich kid.
And prepare you for a career as a professor of philosophy.
for days are working 10 hours a day, try to earn tenure somewhere, but I'm just, it's a kind of a mundane example of the sort of thing. Or your parents take you to get dental work and you hate it, but like years later you go, well, of course they had to like take me to get this dental work. I mean, right? So that in that sense, you eventually acquiesce, or you eventually agree that the suffering your parents subjected you to was a kind of a necessary thing for some greater good, and that good defeats the evil involved in the suffering. And that's essentially the idea, isn't it? We just
yeah. I think that, so it seems to me whenever I start talking about this, I think of nothing but objections the whole way through. Like almost every part of it, every single step, it seems to me, is the sort of thing that I'd want to pick holes in. I mean, just to stick on the example of like getting your father making you work this tedious job as a way of like teaching you blah blah blah. I mean, it doesn't seem to me key at all that you come to realize the benefit that it has. I mean, say you don't ever come to. I mean, if you learn the lesson without realizing that that's what your father was trying to teach you, then you've still learned the lesson. So the understanding of what was going on, the kind of like appreciation of his actions, he plays no role whatsoever.
But there is something to be said for, the effectiveness of the learning process, and it being like, would say, have been more theoretical if it had only been like, something I read or something. But take the dental work one. I mean, that objection doesn't apply to the dental work one, it seems to me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I guess provided that when you grow up, you go, well, I'm glad my parents maybe subjected me to that. I guess you could go your entire life being like bitter about not having worse teeth or something. I mean, or bitter about not making the connection.
But like, it seems like
there it seems like you couldn't just get that like theoretically. You have to go through the dental work process, and any reasonable person would realize that it was a necessary thing and be glad that it was done. Right. So
right. So first of all, then, I guess there's a difference, right? Which is that acceptance of it being necessary seems to be key, right?
yes,
Because you know that your parents couldn't have just fixed your teeth by snapping their fingers or giving you an injection or something. So
right.
for them, the necessity is a consequence of the limited powers. I mean, it's
right.
not something it's really hard to understand why, if God wanted to bestow a moral lesson on you, he couldn't just snap his fingers and have you wake up with that awareness straight away.
That's right.
So does God not understand? Sorry, go on.
I think the better analogy would be, imagine you had to get a vaccine, and you could have chosen the needle, but they also had an oral pill. And the parents know that you hate needles, and it's really painful. And they said, well, we could have the pill or the needle. Go for the needle.
Yeah.
Then it doesn't, you can't, I don't see why you would look back and go, oh,
Right.
that was all worth it in the end. It wasn't.
Yeah, of course.
Right.
Yeah. But wait, there was something I was going to continue. I'll
You
come
go
back.
ahead, Alex. You said you had other objections. Why don't you?
Well, I mean, yeah, like I said, it's every part of this is interesting and worth picking through. But the other thing I was thinking was that, like, the thing that's surely more important is whether or not there is a good reason for the suffering being gone through, rather than that the person comes to know that. I mean, the fact that it's nice if the person comes to know that, but really what matters is whether or not there actually is a justifying reason. So if somebody administers a vaccine to you against your will, it's going to be scary because you don't understand what's happening, but it's very different from if somebody just like stabs you in the arm against your will without there being a vaccine being dished out. So the key thing is that there actually is a benefit. It's like there's a reason, and it's that seems to be doing all of the legwork in maintaining that it's actually a good thing. And they're coming to understand that. It just seems like it's a kind of superficial aspect that goes on top.
But they if you listen to their whole thing, I mean, they and generally, they have recourse often to things like gnomic regularity, or God just makes. At one point, I think Dougherty says, "Look, it's not like a best of all possible. It's not a Leibnizian scenario." Actually, I have an objection to that way of framing it, but it's just a satisficing. So if a world is good enough, then it's made. Of course, if you take the totality of those worlds, there is a maximization going on. So you're back to Leibniz. It all comes down to, do we call this totality one world, or do we call it a bunch of worlds? Yeah. But anyway, the idea is, okay, it's a good enough world. It's got these laws in it, and given those laws, this is sort of how it has to go, right? At least, say, the afterlife, it seems to me like all bets are off. At least in the physical world, it's got but they have to say that, like, yeah, that's a good enough, there's some reason that God couldn't work around that makes it a necessary thing, right? There's no,
Right. And that's where I want to bring it back to the Joshua example that we gave, right? Because the way Dougherty said it was, oh, there was that one time where you let me be cut. No, it wasn't that he let me be cut. No, it was he ordered them to be mutilated.
Yeah.
And it seemed pretty obvious as to why. It's to get victory in the battle, right? So now when the animal goes through this process and they're in the afterlife, and what story is God going to tell them to convince them that it was all necessary? That's what we don't hear, and I can't. That's what we're owed.
What it would be. I mean, but they admit that. I mean, I think they say, like, yeah, for God. I mean, it's as old as the hills. Like, God's ways are higher than our ways, and He sees the infinite story. And if you could, like, get that view, you'd be like, oh yeah, I guess they had to do that. The horses are thinking, oh great, they had to do that to me. I accept it, but it's sort of an extra postulate in their whole story, So it's
and why could they not also, like, come to rebel against God? I mean, when they get to heaven and they're given their rational facilities, obviously we know, according to Christian theology, there are beings that know God and rebelled against Him, Satan, or whoever his minions are.
Yeah.
So why should we not think? They say it's logically possible. That God, they'll endorse all the things that have happened to them and accept God as a savior, whatever it is. Why not think that they actually would rebel rather than endorse? It seems to me, that's more likely.
Yeah, go ahead.
I've got a similar issue, right? Which is about the question of coercion in that situation. Like, if I wake up, if I die and I wake up in heaven, I somehow come to believe that that's really what's happening, and I haven't gone mad or something. And Dougherty has this kind of like picturesque part of his book where he describes I think it's an animal, and it's like in a cottage, and it's like having a cup
Yeah.
of tea, and it gets visited by someone every day. It keeps asking, how are you feeling today? Whatever. Do you want to talk about it? Stuff like that. And he's like, maybe 1 trillion years of this, and they'll come to the conclusion or whatever. But of course, if I start to think to myself, imagine I wake up and I'm like, the horrors I went through, I just can't get them out of my head. They're just awful. I get really pissed off that this guy let that happen. And then I wake up in heaven, and God's like, so you want to talk about it? And I'm like, no. Go away. After a while, after 1 trillion years, let's say, is it possible that I might think to myself, you know what, I better just, it's in my interests to come to terms with this, right? Because as soon as I'm like saying the right things to God and like coming to believe them and turning my life around and, doing what he wants, then I obviously am going to get this massive reward. And otherwise, what am I doing? I'm just kind of sitting around here wasting the afterlife, aren't I? So there's a huge, almost infinite incentive for me to come to see things that way. And that's kind of coercion. It's almost like, it's like you can't enter into a legally binding contract when one party is like has a massive power asymmetry over the other one. I mean, we're not talking geopolitics here, but you can think of examples if you want to about coming into arrangements where one party's got massive advantage over the other. But the reason that that's built into contract law is because it's you're not really freely agreeing to the terms, right? If one party's like got a massive like a dominant kind of power imbalance over you, it's not a fair kind of agreement. And a similar sort of thing just feels here. Like I'm not quite sure that I could really ever put that away, because the gulf between a finite being and this kind of omnipotent agent just makes it like really difficult to see how am I really free to say, actually, you know what, fuck off, I'm not going to do this? Or am I, kind of like massively overbearingly pressured into coming to even no matter how nice he could be, the gangster who says in a nice shop front window you've got here, shame if something happened to it, is talking to you very nicely, and they could do that for 1 trillion years or whatever if you want to. So it's not about like active, like obvious overt coercion, but I just don't see how you could come to a free decision in that asymmetrical situation.
It's a little interesting, isn't it? How they're generally all about free will and God. I mean, at least many Christians. So many are not, but many Christians are all about free will and God not intervening in your free choice. Like that's a sacred like thing for you. From God's point of view, he's not going to do that. And then it's sometimes presented like, well, you can freely choose, burn in hell or infinite. It's still up to you, though, and God's not going to do it. And many Christians think, yes, and some of these sinful humans will just freely choose hell because they really don't want to submit to God. Okay, but then, like, in the afterlife, we won't be able to do that again? It seems like...
Yeah, there's a quote from Doherty. I don't remember the exact wording, but it's something like, everyone's going to be, there are the saints who are saints, and then there are those that will become saints. So they're going to endorse this. If they haven't already, they will in the future. Everyone's included.
Yeah.
How does he but then how is that a free choice, right? Surely if it's a free choice, we should, shouldn't we at least have the possibility that they won't endorse it, that they will say, no, I'm not down with this at all.
Well,
like if you believe in the fall of Lucifer, then you would think like, yeah.
Right. It must be a possibility that would happen.
Like, nope.
I mean,
the other thing he says, well, people live some wonderful lives after their trauma. And I'm like, that's true, but others don't. Right.
That's
so
right.
Why should we think which one it will be? Could easily be, no, they get post-traumatic stress disorder and it grows and grows and gets worse and worse.
That's right. And I think it's sort of like, if the question is it possible that you come to recognize the suffering that you had as being necessary or welcome it, whatever? Is that possible? Of course it's possible, because people have a broad range of levels of insanity. Some of them will accept almost any proposition you want. So, like, it's a sort of trivial question to say, is it possible for somebody to hold this position? Of course they could. The real question, though, is it possible for them to rationally hold that position? And that's not just the same as saying, can it be freely entered into as a belief, or even is the agent rational? I mean, there has to actually. I take it. Rationality is a very broad concept. There's lots of different notions of rationality, but presumably the one that's operational here has at least something along the lines of, to be rational when you hold a belief is to have a reason to believe that, right? I mean, at the very least, it has to have something like that. So the question really would just be, is there a reason? And actually, all this other stuff is just window dressing, because like, if it seems to me it's of secondary importance that a perfectly rational being would come to accept a proposition P. Rather, what's really important is there a reason to accept proposition P? Because if so, the stuff about what the perfect agent would come to believe just sort of falls out. But if not, the stuff about the perfect agent just won't obtain. So really, this thing just determines whether or not a perfect agent would come to that belief. So really, let's just cut the foreplay. What's the reason for thinking that it's all good? Like, it has to be. When I gave you the example of the chism before, I mean, like, we can nod our heads. I mean, we can still talk about this, but it was clear, at least, the idea of like, there's something bad about taking pleasure in somebody else's pain. I mean, you might not have that intuition, but so long as you do, we know what we're talking about. But here, it seems like we can't just sort of hand wave and go, well, it's okay, kind of. I really want to know what sort of reason it could be. I mean, it's just really hard to just assume that. You know, it just seems to me that all this other stuff is just window dressing until we can establish whether or not there is a reason.
Yes, but they're kind of committed to us not being able to say precisely what that reason is, especially like the necessity part. So even if you grant that, like, as they seem to hold, that it's really about, they don't want to put it this way, but that is kind of what they're saying. It's really about maximizing virtue in agents. So there's still a maximization thing going on. It's just virtue is what's to be maximized.
Right.
And that this is either, so they could either say it's a way to do it, it's a good enough way to do it, or it's the best way to do it,
Or the only way.
Or the only way to do it. And none of those are completely clear, you know. I mean, I would be perfectly. I remember teaching. I was teaching some math and science students once in a philosophy class, and I was saying to the math students, well, like, if there was a drug that would make you into a math genius, like, immediately, wouldn't you take it? I'm like, sign me up, I'll take it, you know. And they're like, some of them were like, yeah, some of them were like, no, the struggle is valuable, you know. Like, I learned something from the struggle, but so I guess. You kind of have to ask yourself, like, is the struggle itself intrinsically valuable in some way? The struggle that involves suffering, and is it valuable enough to offset the downside of it? And it seems like they don't really have, they just say, like, maybe. So, and if you can't rule it out, then you can't accuse me of, if you can't sort of a priori rule it out, then.
Yeah, I mean, that's my feeling, is that the logical possibility is sort of cheap, right? So you can imagine any kind of things like that. But I think the issue is what's more probable. You know, that's the issue.
Yes, but we probably, I mean, in this case, I think we cannot, or at least my view is, we have no way of establishing priors for any of this stuff. So yeah. We cannot establish the prior probability of naturalism or the prior probability of God with a soul-making God versus a utility monster God versus a dead God versus, you know, we don't have any way of getting that information. So then all we can kind of do is like, well, likelihood comparison is worthless here too, because they can always build into their hypothesis something that makes the likelihood, in the technical sense of likelihood, you know, really high, like the probability of what you observe given the hypothesis. So then you're really just kind of left with parsimony, and naturalism is the most parsimonious, it seems. So we just have, you know, okay, like on naturalism, it's not. This is a likelihood thing, but it's not. It seems like it's not unreasonable to think that some people would, and some animals maybe, would recover from their trauma and learn from it, and in some ways, and that others would not. You know, and it's not hard to see. I mean, being optimistic and resilient, these are extremely adaptive responses. So you could see why that might happen. But that it doesn't happen on all cases, and some trauma is too much for some people. That's not unexpected on naturalism, right? So it's all just sort of
I mean, taking it back to like
sorry, let me say that's a likelihood issue, but in their case, their likelihoods are cheap because they can just build in whatever they need to get what they observe, and they can always play the card like, well, maybe there's this special reason, but we can say that our hypothesis is more parsimonious because it just says the world, because they've got the world that we describe too, plus a god, plus an afterlife, plus a soul-making intended god. Like those are like really three independent hypotheses. I know he wants to say afterlife is not independent from God, but it's not an obvious entailment. You could imagine a God that doesn't. In fact, in many religions, Judaism historically, there's a God that doesn't give us an afterlife. Right? But
let me raise one more interesting objection whilst we're on the topic, right? Which is that it might be that the Theodicy kind of does too much. Like if you grant absolutely everything, it seems to me that there's this like cool, weird situation that follows. So like suppose what happens is that what's the cleanest way of describing this? And so like imagine you say that when something bad happens to you, like, or if something bad happens in general, some suffering, actually what happens is that's guaranteed because God is good. He's going to make each individual's life meaningful to them and good on the whole, this type of stuff, right? So, if you walk past somebody who's like, drowning or whatever, that if you really believe this, this story about God defeating the evils, you think, well, they're going to benefit from this because they're going to grow. No matter how bad it gets, God's going to like make it up to them in the afterlife with this beatific vision, infinite time in pleasurable heaven, blah blah blah. So actually, by saving them from any suffering that they're going through, you're really depriving the person of the opportunity to benefit from this. Right? What you would be doing, like in a case of defeat, the presence of the bad thing makes the overall situation better than it would have been without that bad thing. And Chisholm says this a number of occasions where like you should be glad, you should be like welcoming an evil that's defeated, right? Because an evil that's defeated contributes to goodness. In the same way, a good that's defeated, like when I'm intrinsically in pleasure, but that's defeated by the fact that my thing I'm intrinsically in pleasure about is some evil. It's not still good. It's just bad. The whole thing is bad, right? So once an evil gets defeated, the whole situation is good. And when a good gets defeated, the whole situation is bad, right? And Adams sort of plays with this. Sort of, I guess, is aware of the challenge, right? And there's this passage I was trying to look for earlier to see if I could quote it on here, but I don't think I'm going to be able to do that off the cuff. But she basically says that, like, yeah, it's still bad. The horrors that you go through are still bad. It's just that they get kind of swamped by this overwhelming kind of like compassion, infinite love, and presence in beatific vision or whatever that it's more than made up for. But I kind of want to say, well, it's not really bad anymore, right? You can't really still say that it's bad, or at least the sense in which you can say that it's bad is evacuated of all of its normative consequences, right? It can be bad, but not in a reason-giving sense. That's the key issue, right? So if you see somebody that's drowning, but you think to yourself, well, all evils are ultimately defeated, and the person who suffers benefits more than the person who doesn't suffer because they get to grow because of all of the stuff that happens to them, then this may be bad in a kind of really thin ersatz sense, but it's not reason giving. I shouldn't, and I don't have a reason to save the person because what they're going through is just a thing. Like it's like saying, oh, I should probably save this kid from having a dental work when you appreciate that in a few years' time he's only going to help them and it's a good. They don't like it now, but they'll grow into it. Blah blah blah. You shouldn't prevent them. You shouldn't just think to yourself, well, it is still bad, so I'll stop them.
Right.
It completely removes your motivation to do that. But if you take this theodicy seriously and you think that God defeats all evils, that just means that you no longer have a normative sense of evil anymore. nothing is evil, right? There's nothing's normatively evil. No, nothing provides you with a reason to prevent it, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, I just think that that's a consequence that's going to be too far for these people to go, because it basically makes you an error theorist about evil. So there can't be any claim that something's evil is false. It's like technically it's all defeated in a wider context. And I just think that's a consequence that's too far for them to go, right?
Yeah. This is actually pointed out by Jean-Paul Sartre, of all people, in some odd passage. I forget where, but he just says, if some theodicy works, then nothing is really evil at the end of the day. And if you think about that, that's kind of disturbing. And one way, I mean, so on the one hand, there's kind of a very strong to kind of lapse into psychology here, a very strong psychological reason to think things like that sometimes. Because sometimes suffering is so bad and so awful that it would be helpful if you could in some way, look beyond it and think it's kind of an illusion, really. The evil is kind of an illusion. It's a helpful thing for dealing with the world. On the other hand, it can make you really insensitive. I mean, potentially really insensitive to evil and suffering. Like, it's not such a, well, all the children around the world who are losing parents or being themselves killed in all the conflicts that are going on in the world right now or throughout time, you kind of go, well, in a few years, give them 10,000 years.
Yeah.
So it kind of like trivializes evil in that way, and you might regard people like, I always refer to it because to me it's such a powerful thing, the rebellion section of the Brothers Karamazov. Because if you know about Dostoevsky is one of these people who wants to say suffering is a kind of a good thing, because you learn from suffering and you get, it has this kind of soul-making capacity. But Ivan Karamazov, his character in that section, is like, he describes, and actually Dostoevsky took those examples from like Russian newspapers of the day, like children being, raised in outhouses and beaten, and a kid being torn to shreds in front of his mother, a serf boy being torn to shreds by the dogs of a landowner, who owned these serfs, or whatever, however you want to think of that, controlled these serfs, because the boy had broken a window, And Ivan Karamazov says, I don't care. Bring me to the great beatific vision, and the mother is hugging her murderer. It's like saying, no, this was a purely evil thing in the world that cannot be erased. And the evil, so if you have that intuition, very strong. Another great literary, it's actually based on real direct experience, Elie Wiesel's book Night, about there's this scene that he describes about watching the ashes go up from the ovens in Auschwitz, and just like intuiting that this evil kind of blots out, God. Like,
yeah,
it's like so it seems with those kind of if you really have those experiences really strongly, it's gonna be harder for you to go, it'll all work out in the end. Take the whole picture. Get the whole picture. And this, if I just may say one more thing, this is also a kind of interesting bone of contention when you look at like the history of existentialism. So Hegel, for example, has this passage where he says history's a slaughter bench, but on Hegel's view, it's all part of like the big scheme of spirit working, whatever you think, if you think it's God or not. There's a lot of debate about what Hegel actually meant, but it has this kind of theodicy sort of sound, like all the suffering. And you call some of the 19th century Russian philosophers who sort of first appropriated Hegel in Russia they call it reconciliation with reality, which I think they get that phrase from Hegel, where they kind of thought, okay, so at first they're like, okay, we just have to accept the czars and they're horrible. It's just our part in history. And then eventually some of them said, no, screw that, like Bakunin and others like became revolutionaries. But Kierkegaard, even though he's a theist too, he kind of thinking of your individual life as dissolving in this big divine system is really, in a way, antithetical to the kind of relationship nature of religion. And there, even though he's a theist, right, you just have to like accept this paradox, this kind of like, you know, you can't really rationalize the suffering in the way that somebody like Hegel wanted to do. And it seems to me like this whole theology is, of course, in kind of the business of rationalizing all this suffering that makes it, in a way, disappear and lose its distinctive nature as evil by figuring into a whole system, which is what's his name, Tan was saying about, on the whole, if you look at the whole thing and the biblical
Well, it's Tan.
So that's
All right.
It's really interesting because there's a lot of that stuff in Adams as well, right? Even though she's like the origin point for this type of theodicy, she very clearly says things like that it's a futile task to try and come up with reasons why God would allow evil. Right? It's just a strange thing for somebody who's a theodicist, basically famous for coming up with a theodicy, to say. But she thinks that like God's like so distant and so much bigger, and the gulf between humans and God is so great that really God doesn't even have any obligations to people. He isn't like required to make sure that you have a really, like, nothing bad ever happens to you or anything. She thinks that she can show how it would make sense for God to be loving towards creatures who live through worlds filled with horrors, and that is by basically swamping them with goodness at the end of their lives, right? So that on the whole, the life, the person could think, well, like whichever one of them it was, then he said, oh, you cut me that one time, but now I've got 1 trillion years of like paradise, so I don't care.
That was Doherty saying that, yeah.
But like underneath it, like if you step back to the starting point of, it's very different from a lot of contemporary theists' perspectives, right? Adams is embracing this vision of God that's like terrifying and so distant from our earthly projects and needs and stuff. It's like barely even aware in the same way. Like she describes this idea that like one way that you would come to how the horrors might be enabling you to kind of identify with God is that a direct experience of the divine is terrifying, right? And like it like makes you feel like trembling with fear in this kind of Kierkegaardian sense, and that you have like overwhelming sense of like impurity and inferiority and blah blah blah, and that like it's the direct experience of what God is like could be just like experience of horrors, right? And I mean, she's not like saying this is definitely right. It's just as kind of like thrown out their argument, but that's also kind of terrifying and not at all what you see in these kind of cookie cutter apologetics arguments and perspective. And God's like this friendly old dude that is always got your back and will make sure you score the touchdown or whatever. It's like, but her vision is like he's this disembodied like agent that's completely divorced from you, doesn't owe you anything, whatever. It's terrifying.
I mean, that is a major strand in both Jewish and Christian theology and Islamic theology, like the kind of otherness of God. So it's just, and Christianity is always had and the other religions too, but it's very clear in Christianity. Has always had a kind of very ambivalent and difficult sort of path to hew here with all those kind of omni attributes that make God seem like some kind of mystic, like you can only like get it by mystical contemplation, and when you add the holiness component, like you should just grovel, and throw your hands up, versus but I love you and I had a plan for your life and I was thinking about you and all this kind of very anthropomorphic stuff. It's kind of a contradictory thing within the heart of Christianity, really.
All right, so I think we should move on to the next clip now. Okay, so the next clip, Mike's replying again about the cruelty of God to animals in the Bible. And what he said, well, we don't take all this literally. And what I said was, it doesn't matter if you take them literally, as God's actions are, they're presented as righteous by the authors. And by the way, Mike made a whole documentary arguing Exodus really did happen, which of course involves lots of violence to the animals. So, for example, the 10th plague, it's not just the death of the firstborn humans, it's all the domestic animals in the first plague, all the fish drown because the water turns into blood. So let's see how they reply.
We know right off the bat they don't know what they're talking about with literalness or non-literalness, because you can't treat the Bible as literal or non-literal. You have to look at individual passages, contexts, genres, authors, etc. But because Mike says, here is a passage that I don't take literally. Oh, see, he doesn't take the Bible literally, but he contradicts himself because over here he does. It's the worst kind of fundamentalist thinking that you can find.
Just because we say there is hagiographic hyperbole in the text, that does not mean we take everything metaphorical. And the point we want to make is, we still recognize that there is this problem of suffering, which we're going to get into here today. But with those specific passages, they would not work, because we would say this is hyperbolic language, not literally God wiping out every single animal on earth with a flood. So like other passages, and then so notice how Phil cuts to like the 10 plagues. Okay, but that's an issue, but that was not the original context of what we were talking about. So
right, I feel like they just missed the point entirely. I never claimed that Mike was contradicting himself because he thinks one bit of the Bible is literal and another one isn't. I never said that. I don't know what the hell they're talking about. What if they read our paper? I'm going to quote the paper that we wrote here, and this is Ken and I, and it says, open quote, a Judeo-Christian theist who rejects biblical literalism may evade some of these problems, but as long as such divine actions and commands are interpreted as morally righteous, one will still be attributing to God a moral character that is in serious tension with our basic moral intuitions. In other words, the very choice of allegories, genocide, animal torture, is itself highly morally problematic, not to mention dangerous. One could write these passages off as being erroneously included in the canon, but the greater the number of passages included in such a list, the higher the cost to the Judeo-Christian theist, close quote. So we do allow for that, some bits can be literal and some others. It's like he didn't even understand the point that was being made. And the reason to quote Exodus is that, well, here's a case where there's it seems to me, clear cruelty to animals in the Bible, and you believe this one, right? You've made a documentary saying it's real. So that's enough. It's not like you're contradicting yourself by saying one bit's literal and when the other bit isn't. It's more that you've conceded here that this bit, right, which has clear cruelty to animals, at least on its face, by God, is something you accept.
Yeah. And you're kind of suggesting there's a dilemma here, like take these passages literally and then God, and take them to be factual, or then God literally commands harming animals, or take them to be metaphorical or allegorical or something, and then the allegories themselves cast God in a questionable moral light. Isn't that basically the dilemma? So we're right. In that paper, we do say, Grant, that they don't necessarily take everything literally. And I think at some point, doesn't he, Mike is his name, is that right?
Yeah.
Doesn't he kind of suggest that the story of the slaughter of the Amalekites in 1 Samuel 15 involved what he calls hagiographical hyperbole?
Yeah.
Although,
and I think Trent denied that one happened.
Oh, okay. Well, if you read the whole story, God eventually gets mad at King Saul for sparing the king and some of the animals.
Right.
Doesn't get mad at him for killing the children.
Right.
Sorry to laugh, and so on. And so just to the point that even if you don't take it literally, if you say, well, it didn't happen, it still kind of casts God in a questionable light. You spared some of the animals, and he's so that's that point. Go ahead,
Alex.
Well, I think that Trent Dougherty is an extremely clever person. Obviously, he's a professional philosopher, and he's written a bunch of stuff that's high quality. So, I mean, just to make sure that that's clear. Like I do respect his chops as a philosopher, but I think it's fair to say that in this video he shows pretty bad like listening skills. Like I don't really think he was trying to understand what you said at all, which I mean he doesn't have to. He was just having a chat with his buddies and stuff. It doesn't really matter if he was being like that, but I mean, and this was a clear case because he summarized what he took to be your argument in such a weird way. Like it wasn't even close to what you were saying. So it just sounded like, to me, it just sounded like he'd made up something that was a bit like what you said, that was much easier to knock down, and he didn't really care if it was that close to what you said or not. He wasn't trying to be charitable or whatever. So I mean, he comes across as an asshole in the video. I mean, I think he wouldn't probably accept that on some level. He probably wouldn't accept it if I asked him. But I think on some level, if you watch that back and thought about, like, he literally impersonates your voice at one point. He's like personally rude about you on several occasions. He says you can barely speak English. I mean, these are just like crazy, ridiculous insults. So, like, I mean, it was just weird. I mean, he doesn't need to do that. I mean, in a sense, it's also like punching down. Like, he's the professional philosopher. He doesn't need to be like saying you sound silly or whatever. He could just like crush your arguments. Surely. I mean, why doesn't he just do that? And actually, I never do this, but I looked at the YouTube comments in that video. There's quite a lot of people. I mean, it's quite obviously there's quite a lot of people who are like fanboying over the whole thing. But there was quite a lot of people who were like saying, I've never seen this Trent guy before, but his attitudes really put me off him. He sounds like an asshole. It was like quite a lot of Christians who were saying, look, I'm a Christian, but I don't like why he was being so aggressive. And like, I've only ever engaged with him a couple of times online and like Facebook, but I'm sure he had no idea who I am. But he was a fucking prick when he was talking to me. Like, he didn't know who I was. He wasn't trying to get some pain. He was just chatting to someone, a stranger on Facebook, just being a dick, right? Like, I don't know. So that's my kind of like baseline Trent Dougherty thing. He's clever, but he's an asshole.
Well, he's got a whole afterlife to work that out of his.
That's true, yeah.
But
it's all part of the soul building process.
Yeah, right. He's got a long way to go.
I mean, one factor here could be that you can kind of get a chip on your shoulder after being relentlessly attacked all the time.
Sure. Yeah.
for your faith. So, and your apologetics. So, I mean, a deeper issue here is, what are the principles whereby you determine if a passage is historical and literal or not? And it seems to be like, how hard will it be for me to? I mean, one uncharitable reading would be, how hard is it for me to, how much is this going to cost me to try to reconcile with my whole view, or my apologetics or not? You just wonder, like, what are really the principles here? And I'm afraid if you look at the history of biblical hermeneutics and our debates about which texts are canonical and not, it seems like there's no really easy way to settle those issues.
Yeah, I'd be really curious to know how many passages the hagiographic, is that the word hagiographic?
Well,
the
hagiography is like the lives of the saints,
Yeah, right, of course. Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, I wonder how many times this rigorous, obviously must be rigorous method that you can use to determine whether something's hagiographic, hyperbole, and whether it's to be taken literally or whatever. I wonder how many times that lands in an awkward way for the theist. He goes, oh, damn, I really wanted this. It would be much more convenient for me if this could be chalked up as hagiographic hyperbole. But it turns out I'm applying the method and I have to treat this bit literally. Damn, I bet that never happens. I mean, maybe it does, but it does seem like it's quite a complicated way of just like reassuring yourself about the bits of the Bible that seem weird. And, I don't think it would ever land in the opposite direction, right? It just makes our lives easier. I mean, I don't know, that's quite cynical, but...
well, it does seem very convenient, doesn't it?
It does, yeah, it does.
Yeah.
Maybe there are loads of examples where it goes the other way, but I've never heard anyone say those.
There's plenty of like obvious figurative language and stuff in the Bible, but like, for these passages that are purporting to be like historical events that God did, it's pretty uniform that it looks like, oh, God is commanding all these things, in Samuel, in Chronicles, in Exodus, and so on. So I don't know how you.
Yeah, I mean, actually, like one example is in Deuteronomy, where a town that says you should go against the Lord, the prescription is, well, you should investigate that town, and if they're found guilty of that, then kill them all and all their animals. Now, you might say, well, God never said that or something, but it's there in the text. And so the question is, why is it there in the text? What's the best explanation for that? And to me, the best explanation is simply that it's written by people of the time that had those moral views.
That's right. And this was
just simpler, right? It's just a simpler explanation.
That's
and
right. I once saw somebody, there's a story in Sun Tzu's, to sort of change the context, but like also from antiquity, Chinese antiquity, Sun Tzu's Art of War. There's like a story in there about an emperor, like just having a whole number of concubines executed to illustrate some point about duty or honor. And it's sort of like, you read it and you go, oh my God, they just like executed these completely innocent people. And so to us, it reads like, this is absolute barbarism, but apparently at the time it was like, oh, that's a kind of an acceptable, maybe it didn't literally happen, but it's a sort of acceptable illustration of this particular virtue or something. So you kind of think, yeah, if you read it in its time and its context, as morally disturbing it might be to us today, it's still like in the context, you go, okay, if you try to use it today and extract a lesson from it today, it's, well, be careful with that. I mean, even if you're just getting a lesson out of it, the framing is like, the actual story is so it's kind of a similar thing. If we just think, well, this is the time, this is what they did back, these are the stories they told in the Bronze Age and Iron Age, problem solved.
Right. So the context of the next clip is that Mike claimed that if we run the problem of animal suffering or our expanded problem, it depends. It assumes utilitarianism, and I said it doesn't. It could be run a whole variety of different moral stances, and I did include emotivism because the reason was my debate partner Alex O'Connor. He's asked about his stance on morality, and he says, "Well, I'm an emotivist," but he still likes to run the argument.
Me if I'm wrong, but emotivism is a position in meta-ethics. Mm-hmm. And utilitarianism is a position in normative ethics. They're not mutually exclusive. You can be an emotivist, non-cognitivist, in your meta-ethics, but that does not mean you're rejecting utilitarianism in your normative ethics. Does Phil not understand the difference here?
I'm pretty sure Phil does not understand the difference. And I know this isn't a debating point, but it was so hard to listen to this at times because he's like, blimey, Governor, there ain't no God, isn't it? British atheism, is like British food. It's like, this isn't really satisfying.
Because emotivism and utilitarianism are not mutually exclusive. This would be like me going to a Buddhist and going, how can you claim to be an atheist? You said you're a Buddhist. Well, everyone knows you can be a Buddhist and an atheist together.
Be a utilitarian, and this wouldn't be a problem. Because since there is no best possible world, we aren't maximizers. We're what decision theorists call satisficers. There is a threshold of goodness that must be passed, but anything above that threshold is equally permissible.
So I'm aware these are different things. I just didn't think it mattered, right? I mean, I just take them to be in tension with each other. And the reason I sort of quoted this was because Mike, you described us assuming a particular value theory. And I took that to mean how you think about ethics, whether it's at the normative or the meta-ethical level. So Alex O'Connor, when he's asked in a debate, his stance on ethics, he said, well, I'm an emotivist. And elsewhere, he's highlighted tensions between emotivists and utilitarianism. And I think, I did think that was in high tension. And I want to concede that you can be an emotivist and utilitarianism. So that is my bad, right? But I just think it's really unlikely that you would be the two. It's a bit like saying, suppose you said you have to be a tech millionaire to be rich, so you have to be in the tech industry to be rich. I said, no, you could win the lottery. And now winning the lottery, one is a different category of things because one is a job and the other one isn't. And also you could be both. But it's just really unlikely that you would be both. And the point is, and I think that's why they don't address, is that none of this changes the point that I don't think you have to be a utilitarian to accept the argument from animal suffering. Or do you think you do? I mean, what do you think?
Right. You don't have to be a utilitarian. In fact,
Right, and that's the key point that they just do not address.
if you're a deontologist like Ivan Karamazov seems to have been, I mean, we can infer that, but then it's the same thing. Like there, it's even worse. If you're a really strict deontologist, you might think you're even though you're rewarding, you're still using them as a means, in a way that's morally problematic, So you could be a deontologist, I think, and run this argument. They wanted to say, they're just presupposing utilitarianism. Oh, and then your response was, well, Alex O'Connor is an emotivist, so no, on the assumption that normally, if you're an emotivist, you're not a utilitarian, which I think is historically, I did find that R.M. Hare developed a view. It's not emotivist, it's prescriptivism. So it's kind of in terms of like what you do with ostensibly indicative, fact stating, moral claims. There's a similarity because you're saying they're not really statements of fact; they're prescriptions. Whereas for emotivists, they're expressions of emotion, right? R.M. Hare has a view that's kind of like what happens when you combine prescriptivism with utilitarianism. Like it ends, I don't know the details, but it kind of ends up there. But you could be an emotivist and a utilitarian. It would be like, yay, maximizing aggregate well-being. Yay.
Because that's right. You just say, well, what goodness is stuff that, if you're an emotivist, it'd be stuff that I like, right? Stuff I'm in favor of or whatever. And then if I'm trying to work out, well, what should I do? Should I make a cup of tea or should I have a beer? Well, I like beer more than tea. So my utilitarianism kicks in and I'm picking beer. But like what it is to be good is whether I like it or not. So they can, obviously they perfectly well fit together if you want to think about it like that. I think...
Like historically, most utilitarians and defenders of it are not emotivists.
I mean, that was really what I was thinking. That was just unlikely to fit the two together. I do want to concede that you can, and that was my mistake, right? I didn't really think about putting.
You didn't say that you couldn't. You just were assuming that like most people who are emotivists are not.
Right.
But
the point is, they don't address at all the main criticism, which is you don't have to be a utilitarian. Like, it's not addressed at all.
Yeah, they get on that. Yeah.
I think that's right. I think they overjuiced the. I was going to say egg. That doesn't really make any sense as an analogy, but they tried to derive more significance out of the mistake. I think it was a kind of an easy to do overstatement or like. Not paying proper attention to the rigid way that these academic terms are used, whatever. So in a technical sense, I think they were right about that. You did say technically the wrong thing. I just think it wasn't particularly significant. And it came across as a bit like sort of policing what people say and just getting, it's they win if you use a technical term slightly incorrectly. I mean, I'm not really interested in that. You could spend your whole life going around responding to YouTube videos where he said necessarily, but actually he should have said contingently, because, and you'll find hundreds and thousands of people, more than you could spend your entire life on the internet doing that. Okay, go ahead, knock yourself out if that's what you want to do, I suppose, but it's not very significant. And I think one of the other clips coming up, very similar sort of thing. I'm say about that. They're just making too much. It doesn't really matter.
Okay, let's move to the next clip. So the next clip, I'm responding to Mike, who said that if we run this argument from animal suffering, it's just an appeal to an emotion. And what I said was, well, it's no more of an appeal to emotion than the moral argument is. If one is invalid, then so is the other.
But it seems like it is. I didn't say it necessarily was. And the reason I said that was because we're, again, as you had said, Trent, we're just saying God did bad thing. I don't like that. Therefore, this is a problem for Christianity. And they're not thinking about the actual logic of it all. So I don't think anyone has ever run a moral argument by saying that, we're by appealing to emotion ever. Saying murder is wrong is not an appeal to emotion. Moral claims are not emotional claims. This was incredibly confusing. And this is the one part I just think Phil did not even present himself in a clear fashion. compared to the other parts of the video.
It is not unexpected that there would be some bad things that would, and again, not brought about. I sort of bought into it there. God isn't, nobody on this panel so far tonight has said God brings these things about. God allows them to happen. He permits them to happen. And we all, I think, understand reasons why God would permit them to happen.
I'm really annoyed about this not brought about bit, because the whole point of our expanded problem of animal suffering is that God does bring them about. Like, that's what we're saying in the Bible. God is cruel to animals, right? And it's like he's not even heard what we're saying, right? You've got to at least address what our point is, right? So when he keeps saying, "Oh, it's not brought about," it is brought about. Like, I mean, does he not? I mean, I guess he doesn't, think the flood happened. Okay, fine. Right, but presumably you might think that the story of Legion, where Jesus, expels the demons into 2,000 pigs that all drown, surely Jesus brought that about. I mean, I don't, it seems like he's not even paying attention to what we're saying.
Yeah,
I think it's difficult to sort of maintain the negligence defense when you're omniscient and omnipotent, etc. Right, like, imagine if you're like the governor that's in charge of a prison, and nothing happens in the prison without your say so. You can certainly make sure that some prisoner starves to death in their cell. Doesn't mean you've come in there and specifically taken food out of his mouth and made him throw up and whatever. You can just say whatever. You can engineer it because you're in charge of the whole prison. Right? You can just make sure the food rations are particularly lacking in calorific content for him, or make sure that he doesn't get them, or something like that, without you having to actively do it. But still, you would be the one that's responsible because you're in charge of the whole prison. So that buck stops with you. And if you find that idea intuitive, then it sort of undermines this idea that there's a relevant distinction to be made here. Like, if God's all powerful, everything that happens has equal relationship to his desires, right? There's not like one set of things that he actively makes happen, and there's some other stuff that he just sort of happens, and he's like looking the other way or distracted or something when that happens, or he wasn't able to do anything. No, he knows everything and he can do everything. So if that's the model of God we're talking about, I just don't see that there can be a distinction between what he allows and what he directly makes happen.
Well, I mean, but isn't their view that, God creates worlds that are good enough, and just those involve, like, as he says in one of these clips, like guardrails or boundary conditions?
That's the next clip.
Within there, there's like freedom, and God. And if you think God creates agents that can, do things freely and initiate stuff. So even though God created you, it's sort of like having a kid, like you have a kid. At a certain point, they're on their own and they're doing stuff you don't want them to do. But like, are you responsible for what? I think that's their model of.
But then it just goes back to what we were talking about before, where it's like you can understand the parent of limited means allowing a sort of painful dental procedure to take place, but the one who could have made it happen without that, the omnipotent parent, you wouldn't say, I understand that. So
we're just back to that.
Same
like, for reasons.
And do you want to comment?
Good.
Do you want to comment on this appeal to emotion? I
didn't quite understand what was the issue there. Who was saying? You were saying what?
So what I was basically, the start of it was that Mike said, "Oh, they're just appealing to emotion. They think animal suffering is bad. They're just appealing to emotion."
Oh,
and I'm like, well, but when you say, something is wrong, I could just say you're appealing to emotion. Well, I don't see a significant difference. You run the moral argument. When they run the moral argument, William Lane Craig, for example, will say, you just know rape is wrong, so there's your objective morality. And couldn't I just say, well, I just know that being cruel to animals is wrong. And so I don't see that there's this significant difference.
I see.
But they're going to say, they're trying to thread a needle here, because on the one hand, they want to say God doesn't directly cause this stuff, but God brings about worlds in which it's possible, and there's an overriding overall reason why that's allowed, and that will, and then of course the animal afterlife and so on, so that will justify. So again, it's like, it's not, the suffering is bad, but it's not, it's kind of, what is it, defeated.
Defeated, yeah. Defeated evil is good.
So it's not, yeah, defeated evil is good. So, and then surely they would agree, though. See, gets back to that whole issue of like, once you think things like that, where are the boundaries on what you do? Like, and the kind of the moral force of the commandments, not to, at least the ones we accept, not to gratuitously kill and not to, steal and stuff. They have this kind of gravitas, like, don't do that, and you will be held accountable. Like, and Jesus, separating the sheep and the goats. Did you do these things? Did you visit people in prison? Did you help the downtrodden and so on? Right? It's like kind of a gravitas that gets lost when you have this kind of big picture theodicy. It's like, yeah, but look at it in the big scheme. Yeah, so you were cruel. You kicked some cats for no reason. Just because you had to get, whatever. In the big scheme, the cats are fine. You're fine.
Well, you've given the cats the opportunity for moral growth.
That's right.
You've done them a favor, done something good. Because nothing bad is bad.
Isn't this similar to the moral paralysis objection to skeptical theism? Like,
yeah.
Like, basically, if you think that God has a good reason for allowing the Holocaust, then you wouldn't stop it, right? But if you had the power to stop the Holocaust, probably you should. Hey, God's got a good reason, then you shouldn't.
It's not just that you think God might have a good reason, it's that you think it's actually good that the Holocaust happened.
Right,
all of the lucky Holocaust survivors now are benefiting from it. Because if this is where it becomes a kind of a dilemma, because if you want to say, look, well, no, actually, it's not good. Like, should I want, at the beginning of my life, to think, I hope a Holocaust happens to me or not, right? I want to say no. I want to, that's a bad thing to think, because Holocausts are bad. I don't want to go through a Holocaust. That would be awful, right? But if if I could shortcut through that, suppose I could pick between two lives, right? One was just a normal thing happens, no extreme horrors and moral tests or whatever. Just a normal life. I'm a kind of like a middle IT manager, wife and kids, 2.4 kid, whatever. Live a normal life, nothing particularly interesting happens, and then I die. And then I wake up in heaven and God goes, you get all the same beatific vision, everything's the same, as if I spend the first 70 years of my life being routinely tortured and blah, 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 and then end up in heaven and it's the same. Those two people, right, you should pick the first life. Better to be the IT manager because you get the same benefit out of it. Like, what's the point of going through the horrors? So in order to make this into something where it's not just completely pointless, Trent has this example of the Gatonator. I don't know why it's a mixture of dog. It's the idea of like you're just having this like chill afternoon, and then all of a sudden Bill Gates turns up. I wonder if it may be better to do this as Elon Musk turns up with his minions, right? And they trash your house and they rip up all these photos and stuff, and they set it on fire. And then as about to walk off, he cuts you a check for $1 billion and says, "There you go, have 10 houses, make a new family, whatever, anything you want." And clearly, in that sense, you've been like more than adequately materially compensated for, right? And he says, well, this is deeply unsatisfying because there's something wrong with going around just burning people's houses down and cutting them a check for $1 billion, right? But that does sound quite similar to if you think on this first thing I'm talking about, where like it doesn't make any difference to the payout, then what's gone on is that God's just come to my house and kicked me about and burnt it down, and then given me a beatific vision and gone, there you go. But also, he's gone over to Phil's house where he hasn't done anything. You can have a beatific vision too. It doesn't matter. So it just makes the suffering pointless. So if you want to avoid that, and it seems like Trent definitely does, you have to say that there's something good about suffering, right, that I don't get unless I suffer. So actually, I'm lucky if I suffer. This is this kind of like upside down Mother Teresa thing, where like the suffering is really the best thing that can happen.
That's Dostoevsky for you too.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. All right, let's move on to the next clip. And here the context is we're going to revisit Dan responding to the claim about the hamstringing of the horses.
For the hamstringing of the horses, I think there are narrative and contextual reasons that we've already addressed for this. And the basic idea that I'm trying to unpack here is it seems like there's just like this arbitrary measure of what would be deemed as justifiable and not justifiable here. Like, anytime you're going to poke it at any particular instance and say, well, God did this, but why didn't he do this instead? That would have been better. well, we could have also just taken that even further and been like, why didn't God just set up a world where there was no war in the first place? God doesn't set up like a blueprint of the way the world's going to come about. God set up kinds of worlds, and then there's like these boundary conditions of what's going to be allowed within that world. And this event just fits within the type of thing that would fall within that type.
Yeah, it's like guardrails when our family likes to go bowling because, you know, it's hilarious. And when my 6-year-old plays, we put up these little rails that keep her from getting a gutter ball. So there's limits, right? There's limits on how bad it can get in any direction.
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's kind of just the same thing. Like for reasons we don't quite understand, God sets up worlds that are good enough and have certain gnomic regularities, and within those, there's a certain space for various kinds of events to happen that God doesn't necessarily prohibit. One of them including, well, commanding. God commanding or being reported to have commanded, cutting the
hamstring of the horses. I wonder if a better analogy wouldn't be going up to one of your bowling opponents and kneecapping them and breaking their arms so that they couldn't bowl anymore. Isn't that a better analogy than having guardrails for your child to what's actually going on in the text that we're describing?
In that particular, yeah. I mean,
it seems like the analogy Trent's using is...
Well, the guardrails are just about like the boundaries, I guess, within which stuff can happen, and this isn't disallowed. I mean, but
yeah, maybe I'm misunderstanding, and I'm quite happy to be wrong about this, but I understood what was going on here. Like, if you say there's no best possible world, which is quite plausible anyway, right? That it's not a singular world, at least that's like kind of best one, maximum. Then, and I guess, you know, I'm inclined to say that there's probably no worst possible world either, right? For any amount of suffering, I could probably imagine a world where there's like one other person suffering as well or something.
Yeah.
So what we've got is like, if God's deciding which possible world to actualize, he can't just say, I'm going to make sure I actualize the best possible world. So what can he do in that situation? He has to sort of pick someone. This is, I guess, going back to this kind of satisfizer attitude rather than a maximizer. And I thought what Fan was saying was like, well, it's like this guardrails thing. So what he's doing is he's saying, I won't let it go, you know, towards the kind of truly depraved end of how bad possible worlds could be. But it's not like I have to, like I'm somehow wrong for, you know, you might say, just include this top segment of possible worlds, like as good as this, and all the way up to the infinite ascending hierarchy of goodness or something. Yeah. That this is the lower threshold. And I took it that his argument was like you saying, well, it's implausible that a lower threshold could be hit, because he could have just teleported the horses or whatever, and that would just is like saying, why can't the threshold be like up a bit or something? Right. And if you take this idea that possible worlds form a kind of infinite range, then anywhere that he draws the boundary is basically as good as anywhere else or something. Like it's hard to sort of motivate that you know, that the boundary has to be here rather than like one increment up on that scale. So I took it that it seems to be something to that argument, right? Once you let go of the idea of a best possible world, it makes God's decision kind of impossible almost to pick, right?
When you've got the afterlife as well, it kind of throws a monkey wrench into the whole thing, because then you might think, why not just if the whole deal is like, you're either going to become a saint, you're going to acquire virtue in this life or in the next life, or you're going to keep growing. Why not then just actualize every possible world where there are agents that of any kind? So there could be worlds that are just full of absolutely vicious agents, nothing but viciousness all the time. Maybe they all kill each other but the afterlife, if your goal was to, you know, this is why I said it seems to me like there's still a kind of maximizing thing going on. You want to maximize the number of virtuous agents, no? Or is there some? Certainly,
no, I think that's right. I think that's what they're going.
But then, if you got an afterlife, then maybe Dougherty should revise the whole thing and say, yeah, like every world, because of the afterlife, is good ultimately, because it all is necessary. Or you could say, well, then you could of course just postulate more cutoffs. Like, well, for reasons we don't understand, it's only the cutoff is here. God has his reasons.
That leads me to a challenge I put to the Connectleys in a debate. This all goes back to them. I said, look, if this doesn't convince you, this sort of stuff, hamstringing the horses and, or drowning all the fish or blah, 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 mass extinction events. If that doesn't convince you God is not good, what would? Like, it seems to me like they're sort of shielding themselves from any possible counter evidence.
Yeah.
That's true. There's something like this argument's almost too good as well.
Yeah.
Like, because what it means is if you really do think what I was talking about before, with it just being this kind of open range of possible worlds where there's never a maximum or a minimum one, anything can be explained away then, because well, Holocaust, they're not the worst thing that could possibly happen, so it doesn't matter, right? Like there's nothing that's the worst thing that could possibly happen. All that, we're just excluding something, and no matter what you think is bad, there's something much worse than that. So we could safely say, well, he's excluded really bad things. Yeah, letting a Holocaust in, that's nothing compared to what he let out, kind of thing. So it's just, it just means that like anything is good again. Like nothing can be really deemed as bad because like this is just trivial compared to what God, stopped us from. Like the world that Ken was just describing, God like doesn't let that happen. He just lets worlds where there's like jazz music and coffee and cool stuff like that. But also occasionally there's a Holocaust. It's like, it's not really that bad on the infinite scale of depravity, right? And I think that's just, it's too easy, I think.
Right, exactly. Right, so next clip, I set Mike apart from Trent Dougherty because in the previous video, Mike made comments like he doesn't think killing animals is necessarily wrong, and he said, I haven't justified that animal suffering is necessarily evil. And to me, that seemed to be suggesting, there isn't a problem to be solved. Whereas Trent Dougherty is very clear in the book. He said, the animal suffering is a serious problem for theism. Now, I did make it really clear that Dougherty thinks he can solve the problem with his soul-making theodicy, right? But what I was trying to contrast was Mike Jones sort of seemed to downplaying that there is a problem, and Dougherty saying, yes, there is a problem, but of course he thinks he can solve it. Source. Now, of course, Dougherty does think he can come up with a solution, but he does recognize there's a serious problem. But Mike's quote about, it's not really wrong to kill animals, seems to reject that.
Notice, again, I did not say it's wrong to kill animals. I said it's not necessarily wrong, Phil. Why are you lying about what I said there? And Trent, do you think we're contradicting you because of a statement you said at the beginning of your book?
Yeah, I know. I just checked, and the phrase prima facie is in there. Now, I guess it's on me for using a Latin phrase, to a Englishman who can barely speak English.
Yes.
I guess he just skipped right over it. It's kind of like, people who the worst kind of readers that just skip over the words that they don't understand what they mean.
Alex,
It's just, I mean, okay, so they play a clip of you saying something like, obviously Trent thinks he's got a solution to this, but nevertheless he says there's a problem to be solved, takes the problem seriously, something like that. Right. And then his accusation is based on the idea that you didn't read the term prima facie because it's Latin, you didn't understand it because you're some cockney geezer who doesn't understand Latin or something. I mean, it's really difficult to watch. I mean, it triggers me so much. It's like,
what?
Exactly. Oh God. But saying like prima facie just means like on its face, just like the first time you look at it, before you think it through, maybe and come to your considered opinion or whatever. Like it seems like there's a problem to be solved, and that, almost word for word what you said. Like he recognizes that he thinks he's got a solution to it, but he thinks that like it seems like a problem before sans the solution or whatever, right? So regardless of what Mike Jones said, Dougherty there just didn't think about what you were saying in anything like a charitable sense. And then the really stupid thing about it is it part of his like jester like kind of commentary on what you were doing was he was accusing you of being a bad reader. But like,
Right.
in doing that, at the same time he's doing that, he's demonstrating his own like failure. He can read. The guy can read. He obviously can. The guy can obviously sit, listen, and understand a sentence. Like, no doubt, he's just not doing it on this occasion, right? He's just not bothering. Doesn't give you the kudos. Doesn't think it's worth his time, or whatever. He's clearly displaying bad comprehension skills. I mean, the irony was silly.
There's some point at which Mike defends you, Phil, very briefly, against Dougherty. He says, I think Phil's smart.
Right. Yes, he did say that. Yes.
Yeah. Kind of like, but what was I didn't quite understand, or maybe don't quite remember the exact.
The context was that Mike Jones had made these statements like, I've pulled them up. Mike said that he doesn't think killing animals is necessarily wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And another one was that I haven't justified that animal suffering is necessarily evil. And to me, my interpretation of that was that he was downplaying that there is a problem to be solved. Because hey, if animal suffering is not necessarily evil, then what's the problem? That's how I interpret it. Maybe I misinterpreted it, but that's how I interpret it. And that's why I think there was a contrast to be made between what Mike was saying and what Trent said in his book.
I see.
Right, which is that there clearly is a problem to be solved, even though he thinks he can solve it.
Right. Okay, so that makes sense now. I just wondered what.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, so let's move on.
I think it's worth just pausing a moment on the phrase, that's X isn't necessarily Y or whatever, right? It has a kind of ambiguity to it, because philosophers use the term necessarily as a term of art, so it means something very precise and particular. And that phrase is also used in that way in colloquial English to mean something like, I'm not sure about whether X implies Y, right? It does, you say something like, I'm not saying he's necessarily a prick, but the guy sounded like a prick or something, right? You're not saying there's some possible world where blah, blah, blah. It doesn't mean anything modal or whatever. It's implying uncertainty. And I felt like I'll probably have to go back and listen to the original, but I thought that that's what he was saying at the time. It was something like maybe they can't experience conscious experiences at all or something, and if maybe they're not they don't suffer in any sense, so there's no problem with evil. And like he was saying, epistemically, it's kind of he considers that to be kind of some live possibility in that sense. But now it sounded like he was walking back from that and saying something like, no, I was saying that it's merely contingently true that there's this problem of animals. And maybe I'm being unfair, I don't know, but even listening back on it, I really still wasn't sure of which of those readings he actually meant at the time. And so he didn't try and clarify. So I'm still not clear if he means he doesn't know if there's a problem of animal suffering, or if he means there might be one, but at best it's contingent. Which of those two things did he mean? I don't know.
So the next clip is about gnomic regularity, and the context here, is we've got this gnomic regularity argument that says animal suffering is justified because of sort of stable, regular laws are required for moral choice. And what I pointed out was that God could have made it so that we can't metabolize meat, and that would still allow gnomic regularity and moral choice, but it could avoid a mass extinction event that humans are causing to animals right now. And then the other point that I made in respect to this was that, God does miracles to harm animals, like in the 10 plagues. So the gnomic regularity defense just couldn't possibly work there, because it's actually caused by God's intervention in the world.
The entire point of a miracle is that it's broadcasted against the backdrop of gnomic regularity.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what would a miracle be if there were not consistent laws of nature?
As the postcard says, if everything was a miracle, nothing would be a miracle.
He doesn't understand the argument I'm making. I'm not saying we need to be able to metabolize everything. I'm saying there might be logical constraints on the laws of nature to get.
No, it's a good example of how he does this word association where he hears you say something about needing to metabolize something, and he's like, no, there's nothing we need to metabolize. And it's like, again, not anything to do with what I was saying. The point is not to live in a garden of delight. The point is to live in a world to become, to grow from virtue to virtue in breadth
Exactly.
and depth with all of our all throughout our lives and throughout our afterlife.
And I hear this in the back of my head. Animals can't experience that.
But they can. Certainly they could, and they've got no evidence whatsoever that they can't or won't.
So I felt that they didn't understand the argument, actually. You know, the point is that God could do a miraculous intervention to stop an entire mass extinction event, right? He could have just changed what we can metabolize and what we can't. So the challenge is, well, why didn't he?
Sure.
And it seems like they just didn't even understand what the problem is. I mean, and again, it doesn't address the divine cruelty issue. And then they said, like he said, we've got no evidence that animals aren't resurrected and go through all this saint-making process. Couldn't I turn this around and say, well, they haven't got any evidence that the animals won't rebel when they get to the afterlife and condemn God? But that's right.
Both possible. I mean, I suppose there's a retreat to possibilities with some of these types of theodicies when they're not having to say, I know this theodicy is true, but that they're saying, if this or something like this were true, then the problem of evil would be solved. So I think it's reasonable, you know, kind of Plantingering sort of idea where you all you have to do is find some way of making the minor and major premise of the logical problem consistent with each other, and that's it. You don't have to believe that that thing is true to avoid the contradiction.
Yeah, it's as old as the hills. I mean, it's just the way to sort of resolve the logical problem of evil, like you say. Oh, it's suffering's not gratuitous. And how is it not? We find some story about that you can't rule out a priori, and it just gets you. It doesn't give you a reason for believing any of it, you know.
Right. I mean, the thing is, in our paper, we didn't present it as a logical argument. We actually made it as an abductive argument. We said, here are these 5 problems. You know, the problem of time. Why has there been so many hundreds of millions of years of animal suffering before humans existed? You know, the problem of creation. Why is the engine of our creation so violent? Problem of divine commands, problem of divine actions, and the Anthropocene. And we said, look, what's the simplest explanation for all of these 5 facts, right? The simplest explanation is the God of the Bible is not real.
And we can explain more with less. I mean, this
exactly.
We have to keep adding stuff or tweaking things and postulating unknown reasons and postulating reasons for why the reasons are unknowable right now and so on. Yeah, I mean, I think we win on parsimony, but they might, and I think these folks typically do. They have like other reasons that are driving them. You know, so they think they got a lot of other evidence based on whatever religious experience or moral argument, or you know, they think they've got other.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it boils down to if you have high priors for God, really high, really high, then you know nothing's going to unseat it, right?
Yeah, and that you're kind of driven to a position like this given those priors. So if we just kind of point out, but like, look really how unparsimonious it is. And it's like, but I've got this. You know, it's really high. Well, I want to say one thing where he says, if everything's a miracle, then nothing's a miracle. I think every occasionalist in the history, well, this is tricky, but there have been occasionalists, theologians, who think, both in the Christian and in the Islamic traditions, who have thought that everything is directly caused by God.
Right.
And even Descartes at one point has this view that even though, there are laws of nature, but God is constantly upholding them.
Didn't Al-Ghazali have that view?
I think so. So to say that if everything is a miracle, then nothing is a miracle, that's not really faithful to the theological tradition on laws of nature, in fact. And the laws of nature issue did become a huge bone of contention in are we going to look at that clip about science and Christianity?
Yeah, that's going to be the last clip. We got two more and we're done.
You know, the way Spinoza defines a law of nature is not a law if there are exceptions to it. So this is why Spinoza argues that there aren't any miracles. There can't be any miracles. So there's a whole debate there. But if you've got miracles, then you've got like something. I mean, in what sense are they laws of nature? You have to have this separation between nature and God, and somehow God has power over nature and can suspend the laws, reach in and suspend the laws. And the whole metaphysics of that is not particularly.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose you've got this on the table possibility that God isn't intervening in the laws of nature, right? What happened is that God's so finely tuned to the laws of nature that there is just some really simple equation that means that the Red Sea parts at exactly that time.
Yeah, you could.
And that isn't an exception to the laws of nature. It just happens that
Just
the laws describe exactly that thing happening.
Yeah.
I mean, so you can cast it that way, but I think
Yeah,
that
I have seen theologians actually make that argument.
yeah, I mean, everything. The human imagination is unlimited. You can cook up any idea you like for anything.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the bottom line.
But
I think it's helpful to go back to the original tension, though, which is that, like, part of the reason the gnomic regularity stuff is brought in is that sometimes it's about saying a reason why God lets some evil things happening is because, well, he loves regularities, he wants us to be able to discover nature's laws and figure out how it works and stuff. And if it was all just like based on his whim, we wouldn't be able to like construct science and come to know the glory of his creation or whatever. So he has to sometimes, too bad for the fawn, or whatever, caught in the forest fire. It would just be worse for the world if God intervened and interrupted the law from happening. It's a sort of net benefit for everyone if those laws are regular and ironclad and don't, let people off the hook when bad stuff is about to happen to them. But the point of tension, I think, is just to say, but hold on. I mean, if you have an idea of God where he's like that and he never that's one thing. But how do you reconcile that with like the seeming interruptions to that cosmic order that we see in the Bible? I mean, like, it's not saying, there couldn't be a miracle unless, what Fan was saying was like, you need to have a backdrop of order in order to contrast it with the miracle or something. So you couldn't have a miracle unless you have order against it.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's sort of missing the point. If you think God prioritizes, thinks that unaccepted regularities is a virtue that sometimes is so good that it's a justifier for allowing evils. If you think that's true, that seems to me the relevant idea and how it relates to the problem of evil. Then you are directly undermining that by saying that sometimes he does, miracles like turning water into wine to display his holiness or something. Because, well, he could have displayed his holiness by, doing miracles that prevented evil from happening rather than just like getting loads of people pissed at a party or something. Why did he do that? Why did he intervene in the natural order then instead of preventing a Holocaust or something? Right? That wouldn't have been a better way to display his holiness, whilst also
doing a miracle to kill all the firstborn Egyptian domestic animals.
Yeah. But you were asking that really nothing that. I mean, there are plenty of things we can't metabolize, and I think that's what Doherty was like. Why is he talking about that? He's just free associating, And but your whole point was like he's really not asking that much of God.
Right.
Themes. I think didn't they go on to discuss like brains? Could our brains have evolved if we weren't carnivores?
Yeah, as if we exactly like. The point is, if you think, I don't know, maybe you think that free will to eat animals is important or something, right? But then there's plenty of things that we can't metabolize. Like we can't metabolize rubber, but there are species of bacteria that can.
Yeah.
Right. So why is God so? Why couldn't God say, well, okay, let's just make sure they don't metabolize meat either, and then we won't get a mass extinction event happening.
Yeah. And he wouldn't have been able to make our brains have our brains evolve. I guess that was their response. Like, it's for all we know, we wouldn't have been able to have evolved brains if we weren't eating meat.
Never intervene.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to the next clip.
Let's move on to the next clip. All right, so the next clip, the context for this one is that Mike said, our moral intuitions, we shouldn't harm animals. They come from Christianity, and I think he was trying to imply they wouldn't be here without Christianity. And I claim, well, no, look, you had the Jains. They strongly opposed violence to animals. So this moral intuition doesn't come from Christianity.
The Western morality system came from Jainism, this tiny religion in India, had barely any influence. It wasn't Christianity. All our moral foundations come from Jainism, guys. You've heard it here, folks. Knowledge values we find in Christianity can come about in other cultures. No one has ever denied that. That doesn't change the fact that Western values are our capacity to want to spread to have empathy and spread love and try to reduce harm. Westerners think this because they're getting their values from Christianity.
Yeah. And then doesn't he go on to say something about the Romans and the Greeks? I mean, I actually, after listening to that, I actually looked up, found an interesting paper about Greek and Roman attitudes toward animal cruelty in antiquity. And it turns out it's a pretty mixed bag. There were some Greeks and Romans who thought, you guys, you shouldn't be cruel, man. What's wrong with you? So totally independent of Christianity, but also a tributary to Western thing. But it's sort of like, oh, come on, man! Like, really, the reason we think cruelty to animals is bad is because of Christianity. I mean, is that what he's saying? I don't know. He took you to be saying we got it from Jainism, but that's not what you were saying.
No, I was. Of course, I wasn't saying that. I was saying the fact that James existed before Christians meant that we didn't get it from Christianity. I would say that we get it. Our empathy is deeply rooted in our DNA. There may be evolutionary reasons to have empathetic responses. Also, we can reason, right?
Yeah.
Also, science has shown us that animals are conscious and they can suffer. And these things put together, right? Yes. Now, of course, people might have believed animals could suffer before science, right? That's not a necessary condition here, right? Sure. But the point is, you don't need Christianity. There's no reason to invoke Christianity here. Now, of course, contingently, it's true that those of us in the West came from a Christian culture. That's obviously true, right? But it's got nothing to do with the argument here. You can't, well, why raise that?
Yeah, and it may be true that Christianity historically, led toward the end of the gladiatorial games and things like that. Okay, fine, but it also led to really horrible exercises of cruelty, like burning heretics at the stake.
Well, also burning cats, right? There was a medieval entertainment when Christianity dominated the Western world of burning cats.
There's just really not there's not
presumably persecuting people for being homosexual is an evil we can credit the onset of Christianity for. But look, I think I don't much care for this type of argument. I just don't care one way or the other about these sort of sociological questions. But look, I think there's two questions to at least be distinguished from one another. One of them is did Christianity in fact precipitate the birth of what we call kind of modernity or whatever? And I think maybe I'm such a colonially influenced sort of white bearded middle-aged man kind of viewpoint of things that the stuff I remember reading about history and this kind of intellectual development stuff, I do think that some of those key ideas of democracy, whatever, blah, 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 kind of Western ideas. Okay, so to the extent that we're going to say there's this good thing called Western civilization, and obviously it came after, it was birthed around the same time as Christianity, no doubt about that, of course, if that's what we mean. I mean, I already hate this, because it kind of undermines any other types of civilization. Like the Chinese, they weren't civilized, and I already hate that. But let's just go along with it. Still, there's a distinction between did this thing happen and then this thing happen afterwards, to which the answer seems to be sort of straightforwardly yes. And there's another one which is is it true that unless this thing happened, this thing wouldn't have happened? And that sort of counterfactual question just seems completely unanswerable. There's just no hope. Historical counterfactuals are super difficult anyway. Would Napoleon have won the Battle of Waterloo if it hadn't been raining? Is it Waterloo? Or was that Waterloo? Was a naval?
Napoleon lost the Battle of Waterloo.
Yeah, he lost the Battle of Waterloo, right? But would he have won? There's one where it's particularly rainy. Right? It's either Trafalgar or Waterloo, right? But the thought is that just if it hadn't been raining that much on that day, the French wouldn't have been so incapacitated by it, and maybe they would have won, right? So there's this sort of thing historical counterfactual historians kick about. But, at the end of the day, it's just for fun, right? There's no actual answer. No one actually could. And sort of trying to say, unless Christianity happened, we wouldn't have these values, just seems something a bit grotesque historical counterfactual. You couldn't possibly really try and answer. None of the contingent things actually happened.
Let me push back, Alex.
Sorry, yeah, go on.
I think that what we're saying, what they were effectively implying was without Christianity, we wouldn't have the care for animals that we do. And the fact that we have people before Christianity that had care for animals implies that statement's false.
Yeah, if that's what he meant, yeah, right.
Well, I mean, I guess you could have had those. I don't know that it does. I mean, like, if we didn't have Christianity, it might be that all Jainism is possible to do is influence like 100 people and nothing else. And for some reason, it's not logically possible for it to influence the rest of the world, in which case, even though Jainism existed, you still need Christianity in order for everyone to take on board this moral insight. Sorry, Ken, go ahead.
I think y'all are saying sort of two different things, because Phil, aren't you just saying something like, well, are you attributing to Mike the claim that only Christianity could have led us to this position, right? Is that, and if you're saying that, then you're.
I took that. Let's put it this way. I don't know what other relevance bringing it. Let's say put it this way: is Christianity a necessary condition for having concern for animals? In which case, I think Jainism disproves that. Right? If it's contingently true that Western culture came from Christianity, and if things that develop differently, we might have different values. Well, that may be so.
Yeah.
Right, but I just don't think it's relevant. So either it's the first one that would be relevant, in which case it's false, or the second one, in which case it wouldn't necessarily be false, but it wouldn't be relevant. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess. I just find this whole question is just full of.
Right.
It's pretty just. I don't know.
Okay, let's move on then.
Oh, go ahead.
Unless you got something else you want to say. No.
Should we move on? We're going to talk about the science thing next.
Yeah. Well, we've got one more thing: the firmament, and then the science, and then
okay.
Okay. So the context of this one, we're moving away from the animal suffering problem now, because it's going back to the debate that I had, and I said, I pointed out that biblical authors believe there really was a solid dome of the sky, the firmament, and I think this clear error is best explained by the fact that the text, didn't have any inspiration from God. It's just made out by the men of the time. So let's see what they're going to say.
Okay. Notice I said God can use the language of the day. Notice what Phil shifts to. Well, the biblical authors thought it was solid. I agree the biblical authors probably did think the sky was solid and the earth was flat. That is completely not the point I was making. The point I was making is God can use the language of their day, even though they had those beliefs, to give theological truths. It was on what God knows and says and thinks, because that's what's important, not beliefs that the biblical authors didn't include in the biblical text.
You think actually there is a dome. It's called the atmosphere. And it is solid, very solid, relative to its surrounding. What's above it and below it. I mean, it's solid enough that things bounce off of it. Most things bounce off our atmosphere. Certainly, it's like a big curved windshield that makes life possible here. If anything, it's almost like, wow, they had a pretty good premonition there.
Wow. I mean, just wow. What is beneath the earth? Sorry, but beneath the atmosphere is the solid land, right? The crust, the mantle, right? And he wants to say that the atmosphere is more solid relative to that. I mean,
well, I think let's be charitable. I think he didn't mean to say above and below it. He just meant to say what's above it. So it's relative to empty space.
Also, solid's like, I mean,
sort of
the point is, the biblical author thought it was a solid dome that prevented waters above it coming in. It's not about like micrometeorites, or solar radiation. He's just totally misunderstood.
Yeah, I mean, really, be helping yourself to some. That's some hermeneutics that I think no biblical scholar would. What he was really talking about was the atmosphere, and which
to be fair,
I don't think Trent Dougherty does this a lot, but like you do find that kind of thing in like creation science literature. Like,
that's
Islamic creation science literature, where like here's what the Quran was actually talking about how the embryos form, the waters, and so on. And you find them kind of taking stuff from contemporary science and using it to interpret very ambiguous or uncertain like passages. But in this case we know like what the basic. Is Phil still there? I mean, we kind of know what the cosmology of the surrounding peoples was, like in Babylon and so on.
Right, and Mike was like, "Oh, well, God could communicate these theological truths, but
Yeah.
what theological truth is supposed to be communicated?
And why would you?
Why couldn't he communicate those truths without saying there's a solid dome of the sky?
And wouldn't it be so much more impressive if the Bible like said stuff that like nobody understood, like very, very clear, and not in some obscure way, but like there will be this thing, and they could even like spell it out, like, the atomic number of gold. There are these tiny particles that make up the nucleus.
Well, of course, like the ancient Indians had an atomist theory of nature even before the Greeks.
I'm saying,
right?
wouldn't it be nice if the Bible, like, pretty clearly told you what the atomic number of gold was or something like that, like where nobody would know what the hell, or that water is H2O before the development. I mean, I don't know how you would do it, but God,
I think that
way, right?
for it to work, then the scroll would have to be like locked away, like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because I just think that if it's said in the mainstream normal Bible, for instance, this doesn't really make sense as an example, but if it said gold is atomic number 79, well, determined Christian, when it's coming around to writing the periodic table for the first time, will just make sure that, like, wherever it goes, gold's right there, 79, right? So it's like you can't really make it, for it to really be a good prediction, you shouldn't even have access to it until the data's in, and then you go, well, what was your prediction now? Because otherwise it's this kind of like, what's this cliche thing about, like, if I order a pudding or whatever and then it arrives, it's not like a prediction that came true, right? It's like, it's just sort of something where I'm influencing it, and now it's coming true, isn't surprising in any way. I mean, I don't know.
Well,
so I just think, like, it doesn't matter.
What about
what I want to say is, to be fair, I think there's a bit of the clip just before that didn't make it into what we just looked at then, where I think, I might be wrong about this, but I think Trent said that his kid, who's like 15, was listening to Phil. Yeah. And when they were talking about it, his kid said to him, no, the Earth does have a dome. And so what Trent was doing was actually explaining what his kid said.
About the atmosphere.
Yeah, about the atmosphere. That's right. So he was dressing it up, and he was like, oh, actually, it's not that stupid because, the dome and whatever, the thing about it being more solid than the completely empty atmosphere above it.
No,
I don't suppose his kid said that, but he was like I think he was giving that idea more credence than if, say, I'd said it, because his kid said it, and he was like trying to. But it's a ridiculous idea. It's a metaphor, I guess, that the atmosphere is a bit like a dome. But it's not a solid dome at all. Like, I guess it's solid in comparison to literally nothing, like the vacuum of space. Yeah. But anything else apart from that, I don't think
solids are like relative.
Gas.
You either are a solid or you're not a solid. Like, the definition of a solid is that if you put it in a container, it maintains its shape. And a liquid, let's take an ice cube, you put it in a container, it maintains its shape. A liquid is something that will take on the shape of its container, and a gas will fill the whole container, right? So there's not like degrees of solidity. You can have higher densities. Maybe that's what he means.
Yeah, he must mean solidity in a kind of colloquial sense, right? In that sense, if it's not the sense anybody uses it, but like, I could be considered a gas in comparison to like a neutron star or something. Okay, right, fine. So in some sense, I'm a gas, and in another sense, I'm
so you're not a gas.
You're just
not a gas.
Yeah.
Like, you are less dense than a neutron star, yes, right? But you are not a gas in any way, shape, or form. But the point is, like, going back to like the original point you're making, there's a clear mistake here, right? In the Bible, it says there's a solid dome. All the other surrounding cultures believe there was a solid dome. It's holding up the waters, right? That's its function, right? So it's nothing like, deflecting little bits of micrometeorites or something like that. Now, what's the best explanation for the mistake? That's what we said. That was the argument that we made. The best explanation for the mistake is that God's not involved. He could, Mike can say, oh, there's some theological truth he wants to communicate. But isn't it just simpler to say God wasn't involved in this story? Yeah. Isn't that just simpler?
Yeah, to have God sort of playing games with I'm going to use the surrounding cosmology to the cosmology of the surrounding peoples to what? To just say that I created the world and set things up a certain way. I guess that's the idea. That's the truth he's communicating. But it doesn't. Yeah, I just kind of think, why would God do that? Why not like use something? But maybe you're right, Alex, that it would be hard for God to pull that off. But I always thought like it's just very weird in general to use a book, like if to communicate your whatever you want to human beings. Like, why use a book? It's like it's so like, why not just tell everybody directly?
Yeah.
The same thing. And so we don't have problems of interpretation and so on, but whatever. If I may, let's say, I don't really like Nietzsche, but he has one quip about the New Testament. He says, it's clever of God to have chosen Greek to communicate his thought to man and not to have written in it better.
Okay, so we're going to go to the last clip, and here I made an argument sort of linking the denial of climate science with Christianity, and especially evangelical Christianity. I showed a poll that had like 90% of atheists accept climate science, and that number for Christians was like half, and it's a third for evangelicals. And I said, if you want to know the harm of Christianity, then look no further, right? And in particular, evangelicals, they were a key demographic in securing Trump's power, and they both tend to deny climate science.
Christianity wasn't the only element that gave rise to science, but Noah J. Efron knows it was a crucial element that gave rise to science. Without it, we wouldn't even have the science we have now to be talking about it. So for him to suggest the Bible led to anti-scientific views is completely backwards when you study history of science.
Good. He held back the Trump derangement syndrome as long as he could. And then towards the end, it had to come out. It just had to come out. Orange man bad.
Yeah. Again, even if Christians deny the science of climate change, that has nothing to do with the solutions to climate change. Because again, Christians seem to be in favor of the best solution, nuclear power, which environmentalists like Michael Schellenberger have been screaming from the rooftops, we're not going to solve this problem without nuclear. 49% of regular churchgoers favor building more nuclear power plants compared to 43% of those who attend service less often. So again, church attendance and conservatives are more in favor of one of the best solutions to climate change, which is nuclear power.
It's not the case that even conservatives don't believe in climate change. They typically just don't believe that it is primarily man-made, or wholly man-made. Not only are they not denying global warming, they're affirming it. They're just giving an alternative, non-anthropocentric explanation. So Phil would do well to look at the subtle data distinguishing between those two features as well, but that sort of subtlety is just lost on him.
You're just
a prick. Fucking prick. This guy
can so crude, Phil. You just come in. Hey, fix everything up. And
I want to do some of these points. Right, because first off, the counterfactual science, we wouldn't have the science without Christianity. How does he know that? Again, I guess that's going back to what you're saying, Alex. You just couldn't know that. I mean, personally, I think one of the key things that led to the rise of modern science was the discovery of the telescope and the microscope. And then that was, by all accounts, an accident. So I'm not convinced by this argument that it was done.
Carl Sagan used to argue that if it weren't for Christianity, then Hellenistic science would have continued to flourish, and we would already be colonizing the stars. Maybe that's a bit hyperbolic.
It's true. Yeah.
But
hagiographic hyperbole, presumably.
But there, Hellenistic science was getting pretty impressive. So,
yeah. I mean, also, moving on to denying, he said denying the science of climate, I would say it has a lot to do with the solution. You're just not going to put all the effort in to fixing the climate crisis if you don't believe there is a climate crisis. That seems reasonably obvious to me. And it's Trent that doesn't understand the difference between accepting climate science and accepting climate change. The climate science is not just the climate is warming up, but that humans are causing it. So when I say they don't accept climate science, that's what I'm referring to. And that is a subtle distinction lost on him.
Well,
and then I want to just
go
on.
No, I was just going to say maybe he thinks that the alternative explanations for global warming offered by the tiny minority of climate scientists still should count as climate science.
Yeah, right. Him saying there's a non-anthropocentric explanation for it. I'm not a climate scientist. I'm not going to pretend that I know anything about this in particular, but like my simple understanding of it is basically it's two facts that are really key to the whole thing. One is man, as in humankind, pumps out shitloads of CO2 into the atmosphere. Like you could deny that, I guess, but like it seems pretty obvious.
Nobody.
The second one is just the second one is just the basic chemical interaction between CO2 and ozone, which is just why the climate is degrading, and that's just a simple, trivial issue in chemistry. Again, not a chemist, I don't know anything about chemistry really, but my understanding is that it's a very simple, repeatable phenomenon where you can just show how the effect of the CO2 floating around in the ozone degrades it. So it's not about like which part of that.
Well, it traps the heat. CO2 traps the heat. That's what it does.
Traps the heat. Yeah.
Okay, but so whatever. Even if I get the chemistry wrong, like I said, I'm not a chemist, but there's some routine, straightforward chemistry that isn't about. It's not political. No one's like, we didn't come up with that after we decided that global warming was real as a way of like justifying it or something. That's just all. So which of the two things do you disagree with? The chemistry or just the fact that we're making CO2? I don't understand how there's this alternative that he's talking about, which is like, maybe it's just getting warm on its own, like.
No, there's a bunch of other like factors like, cloud, ocean, like for a long time, we didn't know that well how much heat the oceans were actually absorbing, and it turns out they're absorbing more heat than we thought. So that
there is an issue of how sensitive the climate is to the amount of CO2 we put out, but it's pretty well established now that human activity is causing excess heating, and that has disastrous consequences. This is the slide that Mike put up, okay? And he said, well, look, conservatives are in favor of the solution, nuclear power. And look, there's a 6-point difference between churchgoers and regular churchgoers and non-regular churchgoers. But like that's 6 points difference, which is not very large. And in fact, we don't know the sample size here, so it could even be statistically insignificant. And otherwise, elsewhere, he talked about this importance of multivariate analysis. And look at what the actual paper that he quotes says. A multivariate logistic regression analysis not shown found no difference between religious affiliation or frequency of a church attendance in its views on nuclear power when controlling for political, educational, and demographic factors. Right, so the paper doesn't really support what he's saying. Let's move on to...
So now, can I just also, before that goes into the history books, the difference between 49 and 43 or whatever it was tiny, it seemed to me. It's not tiny, I guess, but like it wasn't huge. It wasn't like a big disparity. But even then, the groups that were being distinguished between was people who regularly go to church and other people who also go to church, but not quite as often. So like... Right. I'm not in either of those groups, right? So, like, my view isn't even included in that. Like, it's just a group between two types of churchgoers. And anyway, the thing I was thinking was, well, it's all very good if, like, people who go to church often are slightly more in favor of nuclear power. That's fine. But, like, I think the thing I'm more interested in is, like, what's the disparity between, not at this point, like, I don't care about this point either. I mean, I'm not making the argument that like Christians are pro climate change in particular. Like I don't even want to go there. But just because he's bringing this specific thing up, surely the thing to contrast with the multi-valued analysis that we want to see is like, well, what was their attitudes towards burning shitloads of fossil fuels, right? Because it might be like I am mildly more in favor of nuclear than this other guy who doesn't go to church as much as me. But if I'm much more in favor of like burning fossil fuels than that other guy, it doesn't really matter. Like you can't just look at their like abstract favoritism towards one type of power source if you don't include the one that's like truly damaging. Because what if all of those was 90% popularity for whatever it was for fossil fuels, then it doesn't matter. This whole distinction just boils away. So I'd want to see the full data set before I make any big conclusions based on one number against another number or something. Anyway, I'm not a sociologist. I don't care about this issue in the slightest.
Well, I do care about this, because I think if it's the case that Christianity is a contributing factor to opposing climate change, that is incredibly important to know. So, and in fact, when we look at this survey, right, 90% of atheists, right, accept the science of climate change. Then that goes down to 45% for Christians and down to 32% for. That is an enormous difference compared to this 6-point difference on nuclear power. Right?
Don't you think it's a bit myopic to think that this lens of the philosophy of religion distinction that we're talking about between atheists and Christians or something is relevant to this type of concrete political question? I'm just struggling, I really am, because I think that there's so many other things in the mix of particularly contemporary American culture.
There is.
All these other factors, and identifying Christianity as being causal, I'm uncomfortable with that.
I'm only saying it's a contributing factor. I would not for a second say it's the only contributing factor, but these things make a difference. Whether Trump won or lost was down to a few 100,000 votes. So, it may. I would never claim that Christianity is the only reason people oppose climate science. Of course not. But if it contributes, then that's a problem. Right? That's all I'm saying.
It certainly, I've heard it with my own ears. It certainly does in some evangelical circles. I grew up around that. Hell, I was involved in it when I was a teenager, So, though we didn't talk about climate change that much back in the late 1980s, certainly creation science and so-called science and so on, and then there are plenty of anti-vaxxers who have some connection with it. One would really have to do some careful sociology and so on to trace it all out. But just sort of anecdotally, given my upbringing and living in Texas, there's plenty of people who think that this is the climate change. This is all baloney, and it's just a plot that the globalists are trying to use to take over, and impose their will on us and make us accept, transgender athletes and all the other things that they think are terrifying about the globalists, as they like to say. And it is true too that if you look at sort of religiosity in the United States, the red states tend to be more religious, and they also tend economically to be tied up more in fossil fuels. Of course, Texas, it's a great example. The whole economy of the state of Texas is heavily dependent on fossil fuels. But then a lot of the other red states are too, including the Midwestern ones, where it's all farming and they kind of depend on, or there's pipelines. Actually, this recent, I don't know if you heard about this court decision against Greenpeace coming out of North Dakota, 600 claiming they got to pay the company that built the name of it. What's the name of that pipeline that was protested pretty effectively? I
can't remember the name, but I saw the story today.
Anyway, Greenpeace is being assessed a $600 million in a defamation lawsuit, and they made sure they did everything to make sure that this, not Greenpeace, but that this took place in North Dakota, where none of the people on the jury, they're all they couldn't even find people who are not sympathetic to the fossil fuel industry. So I'm just saying, it's tied up with social and both social and economic issues that get mixed in with religious issues, especially.
Exactly.
But hang on, let me address that. Hang on, I've got another slide I want to show. Give me a sec. Hang on.
And if you think the apocalypse is near,
Yeah. Well, that's another issue.
Drill, baby, drill.
Help paper in Nature. Belief in divine versus human control of Earth affects perceived threat of climate change. And so what they say is that regression analysis with national survey data demonstrates that believing God would not allow humans to destroy the Earth is associated with lower concern about climate change. So there is a connection. Again, I'm not saying there's no other factors. Of course, there's loads and loads of other factors, but it is a factor. And then The other thing, Mike was saying that, this was just one survey that showed like 90% of atheists, double that of Christians. But here's another one, right? Now, they didn't have atheists here, but what they did have is people that said religion is important or not important in my life. And the blue here is those that accept the science, which is climate is changing, caused by human activity. The yellow is, I think, except it's changing, but not caused by human activity. And the orange is it's not changing at all. And what you see, again, same pattern, right? Double those that are not important, double for those that say it's, the most important thing in their life. So we see this consistent pattern. And it's same with evolution, right? Evolution, what you see is like 90% of atheists accept evolution. And again, it's lower for Christianity, even lower for evangelical Christianity.
I think there's something about the reason that one of the reasons why I'm reluctant to sort of go along with this sort of thing is that I just think it's impossible to disentangle the social material conditions that those people who, America is a very distinctive place. The material forces acting on it over the last 100 years are very particular, and they're not necessarily the same in different places. Like if you just surveyed, I don't know, Anglican non-evangelicals living in the UK right now, so maybe you get completely different numbers. And I just, it's just like one aspect of those people's lives that you're bringing out. We could easily also look at their racial background or something. Like mostly white people, and it's probably true. And maybe they're like the average college age or average age that they left the education or something. There may be loads of things that are all tied in together. And I kind of want to say a deeper analysis shouldn't fixate on like one aspect, like the religious thing. I almost think like it's not important compared to the I guess I'm sort of showing my like lefty sort of perspective, but I think like the material stuff and class consciousness and educational achievement and stuff like that's probably more important as to how people like accept science than the religion that they come to. Those things are probably influencing how they think about their religion as well. So if you're already in this milieu where it's like capitalist forces controlling the news media and undermining the educational system, and long, very intense connections to Christianity and the fossil fuel industry and blah blah blah, all of those things are just like they all combine together. And I guess what you were saying is it's a contributing factor, and like
that's all I'm saying.
I just think that the analysis of that whole to which it's a contributing factor probably wouldn't pay that much attention to it, as there are much more important contributing factors like the influence of propaganda and the influence of like educational achievement and stuff like that probably are more materially relevant to whether or not, even if it shows up as a trend that say evangelicals are showing, I think probably it's not caused by the religion, it's probably caused by a load of other stuff. But
I think there's two possible mechanisms.
Video if you want. Just my own sort of view, I guess.
I think there's two possible actual mechanisms, right? So one is that if you think that evolution is not true, then you have to believe that the experts are lying to you, right? So it builds up distrust of experts. And what we do see in the United States is that there are a large proportion of Christians who don't believe in evolution, right? So that does build up then a distrust of experts, right? Second mechanism, and that was in the Nature paper, is that if you believe that God is, going to bring about a new heaven or something, God's going to put things right, then you don't care about these things that are in the long term. And there's been real research on this showing that. So that's why this is a relevant contributing factor. Again, not the only contributing factor, but it does make it important. And then I just want to come on to the issue of nuclear power, right? Just to sort of, because that I want to address that. What Mike said was, he's like, well, nuclear power is a solution, and then he says liberals oppose nuclear power, but now he's switched between liberals and, because we were talking about atheists versus Christians, not liberals versus conservatives, and that's relevant here because he wants to do analysis that separates these things out, and he doesn't make the relevant comparison. But the problem with nuclear is that, I'll just show here, I'll skip some of this, but this bit's important. It takes 10 years to build a nuclear power station. And the climate crisis is like needs immediate action.
You can build smaller nuclear reactors faster.
That's true. But then there's also an issue of cost, right? And the particular cost of cleanup. So here's the estimate of the cleanup for Fukushima.
Yes.
Which was 60 trillion yen, which is about $400 billion.
But this
and so now all I'm saying here is that, and the cost overrun of the UK latest nuclear power plant is £28 billion. Now, I'm not saying nuclear shouldn't be part of the equation here, but I think for Mike to just say we've got the solution, it's obvious and easy, and the liberals are opposing it, is not really true, because there's lots of debates about how good nuclear is, and there's plenty of arguments back and forth, and it's not clear what the answer is. And even if it was, it's not really relevant, because what we're talking about is acceptance of climate change and how important that is.
Yeah. There's some promising stuff about developments about thorium salt reactors.
Yeah, they're exciting, but they're unproven as yet.
So a prototype, and so it's like it could be. But I think like one reason it's not the solution, though it could contribute, is you just cannot replace. If you just think about everything that fossil fuels do, there's no easy way to replace that. There's absolutely no easy way to replace it. I mean, there's kind of no way around, unless some unforeseen technological developments happen. A kind of serious economic contraction. Even if the whole Green New Deal thing, and digging up, making it all renewables and so on. I don't know. I mean, maybe you could replace a lot.
I mean, I don't agree with the point. I mean, we can talk. We're not here to debate all the economics of what we should do and what we shouldn't. All my point is that climate change is the biggest crisis.
Absolutely, I agree with you about that. I just think
that's number one.
I'm a dreamer.
Number two is Christianity, particularly in the US, is a contributing factor to climate change opposition to making the appropriate steps. What those appropriate steps are, we can debate, and whether what we should do and what we shouldn't. Right? It's a contributing factor, and that's relevant for our discussion, because why does all this matter? Why do we care whether this stuff's true or not? Well, if it has an impact like that, that's why I care.
I see where you're coming from then.
That's really what I'm saying.
And the whole thing about your Trump derangement, look, man, if you're not, whatever you felt back in November, if you're not experiencing Trump derangement syndrome now, you're not paying any attention. You're just like, your head is in the sand, or you're just committed to, or you think it's good to, for example, arrest and try to deport permanent residents for the exercise of freedom of speech with no criminal charges against them. I don't care if you disagree with what they say. That's what's going on here right now. And that's just one thing. I mean, there's a whole panoply of things that the Trump administration is doing. So it's like the time for Trump derangement syndrome is now.
Right.
And a lot more than just orange man bad or whatever. It's like, this guy's,
right.
That Justice Roberts the Chief Justice had to issue his very mild-mannered rebuke about impeaching federal judge. That means that Roberts said anything means that he recognizes that things are bad. And he doesn't like to say anything,
Right. Well, look, we should probably leave it there.
I actually would defend that proposition. Orange man bad.
Yeah, exactly. Orange man bad. And for me, the worst thing is the drill, baby drill. When you say stuff like that, right, that will have horrific consequences to this planet. And that's why this stuff matters. Orange man is bad. Okay, but we should leave it there.
On that, you agree with
last
Chomsky.
thing, Ken.
I was just going to say that's exactly what Chomsky said about Trump back before Chomsky had a stroke. That the really bad, the worst thing about him, and the worst thing about it is that, because it's that threatens life on Earth, really, or a lot of life on Earth. Certainly threatens human life on Earth. I mean, if we get up to like,
and animal life,
and a lot of animal life. I mean, like, I'm just afraid that the apocalypse is coming. And, like,
Which is what Christianity predicted. So hey, maybe they're
yeah,
right.
it's like a self-fulfilling. It becomes a self-fulfilling. I told you the end was near, and then
All right, let's wrap it up.
that
Then.
note.
Let's wrap it up there.
Yeah. Okay, if you like this content, please give us a
Not
like.
this last bit of content, though.
Not this last bit. And see you next time we have a discussion like this.
All right.
Thanks very much, guys.
Thanks.